Good evening, everyone. Let's bow in. Welcome to the course, the Buddhist Path of Awakening. And we're working our way through the profound treasury of the ocean of Dharma, getting to the end of Volume 1, The Path of Individual Liberation. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Shravakayana and the Pratyekabuddhayana, and we'll be explaining what those are. So Michael is going to lead off with, we're covering chapters 61 and 62 of the Profound Treasury. And Michael?
Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone. And as John said, we'll be talking first about the Shravakayana, which, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, is really the beginning of the Buddhist path. The dividing up, usually we talk about three yanas: Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. But as Trungpa Rinpoche says, in the Nyingma system, the Hinayana is divided into two, the Shravakayana and the Pratyekabuddhayana. Then you have the Mahayana, and then there are actually 6 yanas in the Vajrayana, but that's for another night. So the basic idea of the Shravakayana is that it really adheres very strictly to the words of the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha. The meaning of Shravaka is to listen and hear. So the idea is that it adheres pretty strongly to the teachings of the Buddha, especially the beginning teachings of the Buddha. Trungpa Rinpoche says the Shravakayana is simple and understandable. Its approach is somewhat analytical. You are analyzing samsara and the need for nirvana. And what this really comes down to is really fully understanding the Four Noble Truths and beginning to not only practice meditation, but actually live one's life in light of what one comes to understand of the Four Noble Truths. And again, there's a path quality to this, which we'll talk about in a moment, especially with the notion of renunciation. But as our understanding deepens and as our experience in meditation deepens, our understanding of the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path continues to deepen and deepen. But the first thing is that the Shravakayana really is the yana of individual liberation. At this point, we're simply working with ourselves. And Trungpa Rinpoche really points to the logic of this in the sense of the one of the beneficial things of the Hinayana is that we learn to not cause further harm. Because if we try to help people or work with people without having some understanding of ourselves and some understanding of the path, as he says, there's all kinds of probabilities that will just create further confusion. As he says, you do not try to help others when you yourself are going through immense transformation and confusion. The danger of just blindly rushing off to help is you will not particularly help anyone, but instead contribute further garbage. This kind of goes back a little bit to what we were talking about a week or two back about karma and how you could have a good intention but still have a bad result. And I'm thinking in terms of my own work with emotionally disturbed children, people who come in and really want to be helpful, but their desire to help is tied into some need to feel useful, to feel helpful, to be liked. It ends up becoming somewhat tied to ego problems. And then when things don't go well, these are the people who at times feel the most angry at the people that originally they were trying to help. So they actually end up creating further garbage, just as Trungpa Rinpoche says. And I think there are a lot of examples of that. So the idea is we need some clarity ourselves. We need some discipline ourselves, and we need some understanding ourselves before we can be helpful to someone else. Otherwise, as he says, we just create further garbage. The second thing that he talks about is the importance of renunciation and related to renunciation, the experience of loneliness. So I think it's important to understand that renunciation here is not in the sense of a moralistic or theistic sense of being a good girl or a good boy, but it's really based again on understanding the Four Noble Truths and understanding how ego works, how samsara perpetuates itself. And essentially the fruition of renunciation is we get tired of going in circles. We get tired of creating suffering for ourselves and creating harm for someone else. And with that, we develop, a complete sense of renunciation. Renunciation is tied to some understanding that all of the typical conventional samsaric pursuits at best only provide temporary happiness and a real no solution to the problems of, and all of the things that lead to suffering. And even more so that in pursuing the conventional pursuits, that we end up just further distracting and confusing ourselves. So renunciation, he really ties to aloneness and talks about it in terms of not entertaining ourselves. You could think of renunciation on this level as coming to appreciate simplicity, coming to appreciate not being distracted. And probably begin renunciation, at least in terms of our meditation practice, where when we enter meditation for however long we practice, we let go of, as best we can, conventional activities, conventional pursuits. Not that thoughts of these things don't come up, but that we practice some sense of renunciation, even in entering a period of meditation, an hour, a half hour, or however long we choose to sit. And in that time, we renounce entertainment, we renounce distraction as best we can. We just simply work with learning what it means to become present. And in terms of recognizing the unsatisfactory nature of samsara, there's very much with the Shravakayana a real sense of settling, simplifying, and coming just to appreciate the present moment and experiencing some sense of contentment with just simply the experience of being present, some sense of satisfaction in just simply being present without trying to achieve anything more or without trying to eliminate or push away anything. As he says, with the constant entertainment is based on arrogance and self-indulgence. And if we're, to the extent that we're able to experience renunciation on whatever level we do, that we're not causing further harm to ourselves and others. In the chant that we do in the morning, we say that renunciation is the foot of meditation. To this meditator who is not attached to food and wealth, who cuts the ties to this life, grant your blessings so that I have no desire for honor and gain. So the idea, as he says, it's interesting that the chant mentions food and wealth. I was talking with Sue about that earlier today, because food is something that's necessary. I mean, we do need to eat, but the point is that we can approach these things without attachment, that we don't expect more from these things than what they simply are. Part of where we get caught is because we read into these situations or we impute into situations that they're going to do more for us than they will. So again, with Srivakayana, there really is a sense of coming down to earth and just appreciating the very basic simplicity of things. That yes, we need to eat, but food is just simply what we need to nourish ourselves. It's not something more than that. It's not an escape. It's not a refuge. It simply is what it is. And we're not reading more into it than what we are. And as for attachment to wealth, as with any of the 8 worldly dharmas, we can get caught up in those forever. The pursuit of any of the 8 worldly dharmas, fame and insignificance. And I just think of how people relate to social media nowadays, but it's always been an issue. It's the notion of fame and insignificance as an 8 worldly dharma goes back centuries. Gain and loss, pain and pleasure, praise and blame. I always forget one. Praise and blame. If we get caught up in those, it's going to be very difficult to practice meditation, because rather than turning our mind inward and actually looking at our experience, we're constantly chasing things in the world around us. And this, again, is an aspect of the aloneness or the loneliness that Trungpa Rinpoche talks about, that we need to let go of some of these pursuits. And that the more we understand the Four Noble Truths, which is really at the heart of the Buddha's teaching, the more we understand the necessity of this. And that it's not, again, it's not a moralistic thing. It's just purely what we come to recognize in our experience, especially as we continue to study and practice meditation. We learn very quickly not to touch a hot stove because the feedback is immediate and painful. But some of the things and some of the pain that comes out of samsara pursuits takes a while to develop, so we get fooled. If everything was as immediate as touching a hot stove, renunciation would be very easy. But in fact, there's a path quality to renunciation. He then talks about the Four Noble Truths, and it really very simply, he just says that, that samsara is seen as a disease and that you want to cure this particular sickness. He actually says that you approach samsara with a sense of alarm, which reminded me of such things as saying that the experience of the kleshas, that we should react to the kleshas like a poisonous snake dropped in our lap, that our sense of the danger of what we can find ourselves falling into when we give into aggression, when we give into grasping and passion in a mindless way, when we sink into ignorance, that it's literally that serious, that it's like a poisonous snake landing in our lap, and that we should take action right away to apply prajna to the situation and respond in a way that's skillful rather than acting out on habitual pattern. So the real sense in the Shravakayana of the very immediate reality of the Four Noble Truths and the necessity for mindful action. Otherwise, we give in to habitual patterns and we give in to suffering, and we find ourselves in suffering. As he says, there's a sense of alarm, but it's at the same time, it's very immediate and simple-minded, true, real, and genuine. And again, it's just coming down to really understanding the situation that we're in, as the Buddha presents in the Four Noble Truths. It's interesting also because at the beginning of the chapter, he talks a little bit about how different Western writers have misunderstood Buddhism. I think that's probably less true now, perhaps, than it was when he was presenting, because we are 50 years since he came to North America. But it is, I remember reading in one text about Buddhism that it actually presents a pessimistic view, which is actually not true at all. It's actually a very optimistic view. But I could see how someone might think that if they didn't understand everything that the Buddha is teaching about suffering and so on. But the point is that there is a cessation of suffering. And then even more so when we get into the Mahayana and Vajrayana, the whole idea that we basically possess Buddha nature and that our essential nature is basically good, as opposed to what Trungpa Rinpoche described was a real surprise to him, the whole notion of original sin, that somehow we're fundamentally flawed. But I'm digressing a little bit. He also says some things in here about the Shravaka understanding of reality. And again, this basically comes down to recognizing the egolessness of self, or egolessness of individuality, or the egolessness of individual existence. And basically, what we're talking about here is a whole dualistic approach. And the reason why he calls this two-fold ego is because in any moment of dualistic experience, we set ourselves as I, and then the world as other. So those are the two-fold ego. In both cases, we're taking something as real that isn't actually real at all from a Buddhist point of view. And the Shravakayana approach to coming to understand the lack of reality is to break things down into parts, or as he says, atoms and instants. And Partly this comes from looking at some of the Buddha's teaching on karma and how causes and conditions create things. The Buddha talks about things being dependent on each other in order to exist. And the analogy actually that he used was like a roof, where you have two things put together that make a roof. But for the roof to exist, one has to depend on the other. If you take away one, the whole thing collapses. So that what appears as a real object actually is actually made up of causes and conditions. And in terms of the self, um, that the self also can be broken down into parts. So we've talked about the five skandhas. It gets broken down further into the different sense consciousnesses, dhatus, the eye as a sense organ, the perceived form, and then the eye consciousness. All of these things, it gets broken down into all of these pieces. And the Shravakayana actually, as he says, attributes some hidden reality to these things, which then gets clarified or worked with further in the other yanas. But essentially, what we take to be one solid reality is made up of all these parts. And all of these parts in themselves are impermanent. And as we sit in meditation, we come to realize that this ego of self just doesn't exist. That in fact, if we look at a moment of perception, if we look at a moment of feeling, that we become to understand that the idea of self is really an overlay on the experience, that rather than just seeing it, we overlay that with a sense of I am seeing, or I see, or we have a feeling and it becomes my feeling. And that as we sit in meditation and sit in particularly shamatha meditation, which I'll talk about in a moment, we come to simplify our experience, that we look at each single moment. It's very much a moment by moment by moment quality to the Shravakayana. And we look at each single moment, we come to see that the self is really an overlay in our experience, and that in itself, it doesn't exist. It only comes to exist because we think it exists. It's a thought that we create. It's a story that we create. And that this becomes increasingly clear as we settle in meditation practice, as we slow down in meditation practice, as we simplify our experience in meditation practice to just this moment, which is why near the end of the chapter, he talks about pure shamatha as being the practice of the Shravaka. He talks about 4 levels of students in terms of Shravakayana practice. And basically, the idea here of the 4 levels of student really depends on the level of vows and rules that the student adheres to. So you begin with a student who's a beginner, and then you have a student who's taken refuge and maybe the 5 precepts, not to kill, not to drink alcoholic substances, to refrain from sexual misconduct. And I'm skipping, I can't remember the other 2, but there are 5. And then it goes on to someone who becomes fully ordained as a monk. And the idea of the rules really is to promote mindfulness. I mean, in another article that I read, he said that basically with all of these monastic rules, the idea was to work on mind by working with how you work with the environment. That basically a monk only had just a very few possessions, and they were really expected to take care of each one of them in very particular ways. So again, we're back to that moment to moment, each single thing, really paying attention. Experience, and that it's through this discipline that we come to realize the ego of individuality, the egolessness of individuality, the insubstantiality of this. And he talks about pure shamatha, just the practice of settling, being present, coming back when we realize we're distracted. Not so much the kind of expansive and inquisitive quality that really comes in with Vipassana, but just really paying attention to our experience in the moment. And that through this kind of very disciplined practice, we really come to understand the 4 Noble Truths. We come to understand the importance of renunciation in order to be able to practice, so that we're not consumed with the activities of daily life and consumed with the ordinary conventional preoccupations. Not that we don't, as he says, you work to create a reasonably comfortable existence for yourself, but we don't become caught up in attachments, and we don't get caught up in all of the dramas that we would otherwise be caught up in. And we're willing to experience some aloneness, some loneliness in order to accomplish this, because we come to understand the nature of suffering. We come to understand how suffering is created, and we come to understand how we can bring about the cessation of suffering through our practice and study. And again, just in terms of the attachments, the important thing here really, and with renunciation, the important thing here really is understanding the nature of attachment. That it's not, it would be a misunderstanding to think that the danger is actually out there, when in fact, the real problem is how we relate to things. It's how we perceive things to be real that aren't. And again, this begins with just understanding how all these parts come together to make something that's in reality impermanent and insubstantial. And that we then, once we have take an appearance as real, then we grasp after that. As Tilopa said to Naropa, it's not appearances that bind you, it's the attachment to the appearances that binds you. So through just moment to moment, simply settling, simply being present, simply being aware of what's in our minds and what we're experiencing, that we come to work ourselves free of that. And when we do that, we achieve the achievement of Shravakayana, which he puts in two categories. One is wearing out, that we actually wear out our habitual patterns. We wear out our misunderstanding, our mistaken belief in a self. And that as we're able to do that, then we experience non-birth, because we're able to begin to not create the conditions that cause the birth of further suffering and the birth of further confusion. So that's what I had to say about the Shravakayana, and I'll let John take it from here. You must unmute.
I just did. Thank you, Michael. Good. Wow. That was terrific. I'm going to make just a couple more comments about this. His emphasis on loneliness, starting with aloneness and then taking it right into loneliness, that this is an important experience for the Shravaka. I recommend at some point going into solitary retreat. You can really experience the aloneness and loneliness in solitary retreat. It's a core practice in the Tibetan tradition, especially for Kagyus and Nyingmas, which we are in that tradition, those two of the four sects. And Trungpa Rinpoche emphasizes this a lot, that we spend so much time in our lives distracting ourselves with one form of entertainment or another. Might be movies, television, might be our jobs, our work, might be conversations with others. And in this way, we pass the time. When you go into retreat, it's a very interesting experience, because you're giving up entertainment. And it's really an opportunity, as Trungpa Rinpoche said, to meet your own mind. Because without the distractions that we fill our days with, we really begin to see ourselves much more clearly. And there is a quality of loneliness and aloneness that arises in solitary retreat. When you go in, you give up all forms of entertainment. There is no writing, no music. You're giving up communication with others unless it's absolutely necessary, which generally means some form of illness has overtaken you. And the only reading that you can do is just for inspiration at night. It's called, among other things, kusulu practice. Kusulu is a person who renounces entertainment, and you go into retreat, and as they say, pardon the crudeness, but you just eat, shit, sleep, and meditate, practice. And when you do that, you really begin to encounter your own mind in a way that's very profound. There's a kind of courageousness to it, but it's also an excellent preparation, because ultimately we are born alone and we die alone. And the going into retreat is kind of experiencing that in advance. The Shravaka definitely is cultivating that kind of experience through their practice, the practice of shamatha, and through their study, the study of the Four Noble Truths. One can really only appreciate the Four Noble Truths when one begins, I think, more and more to appreciate aloneness. And it's a hard path to do that because we have so many ways of avoiding that in our lives that are just built in to the structure of our society. So the Shravaka means the listener, one who listens to and proclaims the teachings, is the first stage of the path. As Michael said, in the Nyingma scheme of the path, there are 9 stages. In the Kagyu, there are, let me think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stages. Trungpa Rinpoche's teacher was Nyingma, and he favored the Nyingma approach of 9 stages of the path. These stages are called yanas. Yana means vehicle, literally, like a cart or a car. And the first stage of the path, there are 3 main divisions: the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. The Hinayana has the 2 subdivisions of which Michael has spoken about the first. The Shravakayana is the yana of the hearers. And then the second division of the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, is the Pratyekabuddha vehicle. It means the vehicle of the self-enlightened Buddhas. We'll come back to that. The Mahayana, which is the yana, it's the third, is divided into 10 stages that are called bhumis. And then when you get to the Vajrayana, in the Nyingma scheme, it has 6 subdivisions, all yanas. And we're not going to go into them tonight. If we get through the second volume of the Profound Treasury, then we may well enter the Vajrayana and start dealing with those yanas, those 6. So tonight we're on the second of the division of the Hinayana. The Hinayana is the lesser vehicle. Hina means lesser. Trungpa Rinpoche felt that was too much of a put down, and he preferred to translate that as foundational vehicle. It's the foundation. It's where we start. It's where we build our foundation. And the foundation that we build in the Shravakayana, as Michael just said, is based on the practice of shamatha meditation, the practice of renunciation, which doesn't mean literally sort of tearing off your clothes or giving up food or sex. What it means is renouncing the entertainment value, the constant wish to sort of assuage our loneliness with one activity or another. And instead, coming back to the loneliness and the aloneness of simple awareness in the present moment, which is what shamatha meditation and all meditation is about. The Pratyekabuddhayana. Now, Trungpa Rinpoche, in this chapter, it's kind of schizophrenic. On the one hand, he's putting down the Pratyekabuddhayana, and on the other hand, he's building them up. My guess is that when this chapter was put together, they were using different seminary talks from different years. And in one year, he may have been very negative about the Pratyekabuddhayana, and in another, very positive. The negativity comes from the Pratyekabuddha's aloneness. I just said aloneness is a virtue. Here, it becomes a kind of arrogance that the Pratyekabuddha, the self-enlightened Buddha, doesn't need anybody else, that's fine, and doesn't want anybody else, that's not so fine, and cuts themselves off and dwells in a kind of solitary arrogance. He says of them that there are two main types of Pratyekabuddhas. And again, this is the negative side that he's presenting. The two main types he calls, there are parrots and there are rhinoceroses. The parrots are actually fewer in number. That's less common among the Pratyekabuddhayana. They're very chirpy and they're very social. The rhinoceroses are much more common. And these are the kind of yogis who seek out solitude and scorn social involvement with other people, and really are not about helping others at all. And the prototypical rhinoceros Pratyekabuddha, self-enlightened Buddha, goes off into a charnel ground. This is in India. They had places where, when you died, if your family could afford it, they would have your body cremated. And if you were really proper, they would be cremated on the banks of the Ganges River near Delhi, and then your ashes would be scattered into the river. But if your family couldn't afford to pay for your cremation, then your body might just be carted out into a special place, a so-called charnel ground, and left there for animals to eat. Well, yogis, especially Pratyekabuddhas, would go and pursuing that path, they would go and meditate in a charnel ground, because the proximity of death was so intense that it would inspire them more to pursue the path rather than become involved in time-wasting entertainments that would eventually lead them to their death, and suddenly they would realize they had died and they had just spent their life pursuing useless entertainments. So they would go to charnel grounds, and the classic stories of the yogi who picks up a bone, from a corpse and says, "Death. Where does death come from? Death comes from birth. Where does birth come from? Birth comes from becoming, having a worldly existence. And where does that come from?" And what the yogi is doing is he's working backwards through a teaching called the 12 Nadanas. The 12 Nadanas are the 12 links of dependent co-origination. And what this means is ego is a constant evolution of becoming from one thing to the next, until it finally, and it starts with ignorance, which is the first Nadana, and it builds all the way up to birth and death. Now, I sent out a document late, but I did send it out to you. It's a document on the 12 Nadanas, and I sent out a second one as well that lists the Dharmas, they're called, the 75 Dharmas, because this is what the 12 Nadanas are built on. The Hinayanist, the Hinayana view of life is that, in truth, this world is made up of a collection of experiences which arise moment to moment, and we gloss them with names. The most powerful and important one is the name I, which is actually a cover, or a gloss, you might say, for a whole collection of experiences which are going on moment to moment, and which we lump together under this name I. The classic example of this is you take a cart, the word cart, and you've got this cart, but what actually you're looking at is a collection of boards that form a bed with sides, axles wheels, something to pull the cart, all these parts. But we gloss it with the word cart. In the same way, we gloss the self with the word I. But what actually I is a collection of moment-to-moment experiences of all kinds. If you look at the list, which I've sent, you may have looked at it or you may not, you can look at it later. There are 75 different elements of experience, you might call them. They're called dharmas. This is a new meaning for the word dharma for many of you. Dharma here means an element or an atom of experience. And these 75, some of them are material, some of them are mental, some of them are neither mental nor material, but they arise momentarily in the instant. In the Hinayana view of dharmas, they actually exist for an instant of time. The usual time limit that they exist is 1/60th of a second. So you might have a flash of hatred, and you might have a succession of flashes of hatred, each one of which lasts 1/60th of a second. Or, as they say in the teachings, if you were to stack 60 flower petals and drive a pin through all of them, the amount of time it takes that pin to penetrate one flower petal is the amount of time that a dharma, an experience of life, goes on for that one brief momentary moment. And there are all these different dharmas, 75 of them. Some of them are like hatred, intelligence, prajna. Some of them are lust. These are the mental dharmas. There are a whole class of them. And then there are physical dharmas like form, color, shape, all these different kinds. There are also some dharmas which they felt they couldn't classify as being either physical or mental, and they were neither of those. What the Pratyekabuddhayana is doing is he's seeing the self and his momentary experience as momentary flashings, which occur and then pass, just like these words that are coming out of my mouth, just like this gesture that I make now. It's there and it's gone. But we talk about things as though they have true existence. And you sitting there might say, well, there's John, and he has true existence. When in fact, what a Pratyekabuddhayana would say, or even a Shravaka, is that what you're experiencing is nothing more than a flashing of momentary experiences which are passing instant by instant. And one is glossing them with the name, I, John, whatever it may be. So the Pratyekabuddha, especially the rhinoceros type, goes off into the charnel ground and he meditates on this. He picks up the bone and he says, where did the bone come from? Well, the bone came from old age and death. And where did old age and death come from? It came from birth. And where did birth come from? It came from being, like we're being right now, all of us. And where did being come from? It came from grasping that we wanted to become. And they work backwards through it, all the way to the first cause of existence, which is ignorance, ignoring the space of our being, the ground of our being, in which everything is flashing and disappearing moment by moment. He says of these Pratyekabuddhas in their worst sense that they're arrogant. They do have an understanding of truth and discipline, but they tend to hide out in solitary situations. They have little desire, except for the parrots, and so they're not sociable. The parrots are sociable. Highly intelligent, very intellectual, and they don't relate to hierarchy or organization. It's kind of the self-made person approach. They might appreciate nature and poetry as well as hardship and industrious work, but they don't like organized religion. It's part of their arrogance, and prefer to use their own resources. They just want to be left alone. Their virtue, they are not nuisances to society. They cause no harm, but they don't want to contribute to it either. The view of the Pratyekabuddha is that they hear the Four Noble Truths, and then they go off alone to contemplate the Four Noble Truths and try to understanding that was already developed in the Shravakayana. They also contemplate the Nadana Principle, which is this principle that birth and that ignorance leads to karmic formation. That means if you're ignorant, then you believe in I and other, and suddenly you start collecting all kinds of stories, and these lie in memory, and they form our karma. And that this produces a sense of I, which is consciousness. And out of the sense of I comes a whole development of an ego structure, which is described in the five skandhas, which we've studied before. And as well, we develop the senses, the six senses, and the six senses are, the five senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, plus the awareness of mind, mental events, making six. And that when we have these, then we get contact. Contact means that we have a mind which sees through an organ like the eye and makes contact with an object, a visual object. And the same for the ear. We have a mind that sees through the organ of the ear or hears through the organ of the ear and hears a sound and so forth with all of the six. And that this contact leads to feelings. The feeling of that we like, or we have a positive feeling about that thing that we're contacting, that sound, or that person, or that sight, or we could have a negative feeling, or we could be indifferent. These are the three fundamental kinds of feelings. And feeling leads to craving, which is the seventh Nadana. Craving can be you want to pull that thing to you, if it's positive, or it can be a craving to get rid of it because it's negative, it's going to threaten your well-being, or indifference. These are the three styles of craving. And these lead to action. You go into action. If the craving is positive, you pull it to you. If it's negative, you push it away. And if it's indifferent, you leave it the same place. And this propels you into a new mode of being, which is called being, bhava, becoming. So for instance, you see something, a piece of food, and you have a contact with it. You see it with your eyes, or perhaps you smell it with your nose, and it produces a positive feeling, let's say, and that produces a thirst, a craving for it. So you go into the next stage, which is you pull it towards you, and then you become the person who is now eating that piece of food. And that is the birth into a new kind of being. We do this all the time in our lives. We do it with our lives altogether. And once you become that, you're born into that state, eventually there's an end to it, which is the death. And you die. That meal dies, it's over, and it passes. Your life eventually dies. And so this can be taken in sort of a long way for your whole life. It can be taken in a very short way for just a moment or a minute or minutes or an hour of your life. And we can study this. We have studied this in the past, and we'll do it again. But you can take a look at this, the 12 Nadanas here. Now, the achievement of the Pratyekabuddhayana, and of the Shravakayana for that matter, the achievement of the Hinayana altogether, this stage of the path that develops through the contemplation of the Four Noble Truths, through the practice of shamatha, meditation, and ultimately Vipassana, awareness meditation, and through contemplation of the teachings like the 12 Nadanas. The achievement is what's called the one-fold, or sometimes the 1.5-fold egolessness. As Michael said, ego involves two parts, belief in I and belief in other. They go together. If you believe in yourself, you're constantly looking to things out there to confirm your existence. If that's there, then I must be here. If I'm here, I'm seeing that out there. So it's a two-way relationship. This is called the two-fold egolessness. What the practitioner at the level of the Hinayana begins to discover is that I is just a name. It isn't actually true. There is no I. There is just a constant arising and passing away of experience in the present moment. I is just a label we put on it, like cart for a cart. I is just a label that we put on the collection of experiences that are located here. Or as one teacher once said, I is just a very loud sound because it's right here in your ears. And so the Pratyekabuddha begins to understand the 1.5-fold egolessness. They begin to understand that I is nothing more than a collection of parts, and that other is too. The reason it's not a two-fold egolessness is that they still believe in the Dharmas, in the parts. They still believe that these things have true existence, even if it's only for an instant, that these things arise and pass away, and that there are things which arise and pass away. And so they haven't fully penetrated to reality. That happens at the level of the Mahayana, with the discovery of emptiness, shunyata. So they try to hang on to the egolessness of dharmas as a solid thing. They have to try to hang on to dharmas as a solid thing. He says, the problem is that they're still very much a practitioner, somebody who is discovering something. He says, you are home. If you are thinking that there is nobody home. In other words, if you're thinking, I don't exist, I'm thinking, I don't exist. So the Pratyekabuddha does not actually experience the egolessness of self in the fullest sense. He denies the existence of this and that, but he still believes in the denial. That is the problem. Still believes in the denial, still believes in the path, in getting somewhere, in discovering something. He, she hasn't come fully present, hasn't begun to realize that the reality of this, still feeling that there is a path to some greater reality. He says, so the experience of egolessness of self at this level is on a somewhat intellectual, experiential level. You have not quite fully felt it, and you haven't gotten to the non-existence of dharmas at all. The non-existence of all of this, which is really when one begins to experience shunyata and the luminosity of this world. He says in the Shravakayana, the one that Michael just described, the emphasis is on realizing that samsara, confusion, is a lot of pain. That's the first noble truth, dukkha. Realizing that, we begin to practice our meditation and work our way through the Four Noble Truths, taming our minds using discipline and the shamatha practice to achieve a cessation of suffering. Whenever one comes present, one is giving up the suffering of ego. Ego always is like a step back, a loss of consciousness into thought. But whenever we come fully present, right here and now, there's no room for that thought, no room for that thought of I, with its sorrow, with its fear that it doesn't actually exist, because it doesn't. So we are beginning to overcome that fear and that suffering of ego through the practice of our shamatha meditation. That's why when you practice shamatha, you experience peace. It is a calming of neurosis. The neurosis is always about worrying about me. But when we focus our minds one-pointedly on an object like the breath, we're giving up that, to some degree, that constant thought of me, I, how am I doing? Worry. Going on, we develop Vipassana awareness on top of mindfulness, shamatha. And that brings prajna. Prajna is a kind of intelligence. It's the clear, it's not intellectual intelligence, it's the clear awareness of this world as it arises in the instant, in the present moment. When we're lost in thought, we lose track of what's going on. But when we come back with Vipassana meditation, with awareness, then we see everything very clearly. And awareness begins to permeate our lives to a greater extent the more we practice. And what they say is at this level, the 12 Nadana Principle becomes clearer and clearer. The way in which we go from one of the Nadanas to the next, to the next, to the next, building ego and experiencing suffering. We begin to see that and we begin to cut that chain. There is one place that you can cut that chain, by the way, and it's between the 7th and 8th Nadanas, that you get a feeling about something and it's positive, negative, or neutral. That's the 7th Nadana. And then the 8th Nadana is that then you develop a thirst. You want to pull it towards you or push it away. If between those two events, the feeling, positive, negative, neutral, and going into action, you instead come aware. You cut the karmic chain, you cut the Nadana chain, and you come into awareness, which is open and free. That's the one place in the chain of the 12 Nadanas that we can achieve freedom from karma and freedom from that endless cycle. He says, beyond that, we develop humbleness. Now he's talking about the positive aspect of the Pratyekabuddhayana and Shravakayana. We develop humbleness with regard to learning or achievements accumulated through the Hinayana discipline. It's absolutely necessary. If we are prideful, arrogant about it, it just reinforces ego. But humility has the feeling of, I'm just nothing. I'm just aware. I'm just here. Many people have done this before. I'm doing it. I'm really glad to be doing it. And it's very, very small. It's very little. It's just completely simple here. He says, in the Shravakayana, we realize that everything is suffering, which brings us down from arrogance and simplifies things. In the Pratyekabuddhayana, we realize that everything is discipline. It's the discipline of our practice, the discipline of coming back to awareness, the discipline of beginning to see the truth of the teachings. These 2 points make it so that everything is workable and that we are becoming free of arrogance. He says our arrogance and our not being in touch with reality is reflected back to us by the world. And this produces further humility, humbleness. And he says of this, we realize that humbleness is the dwelling place of the ancestors, talking about the lineage of enlightened beings. And we begin to emulate and appreciate our teacher. We sense that our teacher is the living Dharma altogether. Therefore, we experience tremendous appreciation and gratitude toward the teacher. By emulating the teacher, we begin to attain individual salvation, the Hinayana path in a nutshell. When you become a Pratyekabuddha person, you become fully soso-tarpa. Soso-tarpa is individual liberation. Tarpa means to be liberated or liberation, and soso means individual, one person. So we become fully individualized, liberated. And that means that we begin to discover the egolessness of self. And what that is synonymous with is we begin to become kind. We begin to develop maitri, compassion towards ourselves. See, the belief in an ego, the self, because it doesn't actually exist, it's just a name, but we do cling to it, and it's constantly fleeing away from us. Every time we come present, which we do all the time, ego dissolves. So it has built within it its own death. And we're constantly afraid of that. So we're constantly looking for ways to bolster up our belief in our ego, our feeling that, yes, I'm solid. Yes, I do exist. Yes, I'm ongoing and okay. And that constant bolstering, that constant attempt to assuage the fear that we don't exist is very painful. We're constantly looking for things to assure us that we're well, we're okay, that we're in good hands, we're in good shape. And it's very painful. So as we begin to discover egolessness, we begin to develop real compassion for ourselves to the extent that we even exist or don't exist, that we begin to develop a kind of kindness to this being, this constant becoming that we are. Finally, there's Vipassana, which means that you don't, Vipassana awareness, shamatha is coming back from dreams of the past and the future into awareness of this present moment. It's terrific. But it's usually done with an object so that our awareness is one-pointed, like the breath. And it's not practical. You can't walk around with your awareness focused on the breath. You can't drive a car with your awareness focused on the breath. You would have an accident. Vipassana is expanding that awareness in the present moment and taking it out to encompass everything, this whole world. In the beginning, we treat that awareness of the environment as another thing. But eventually we begin to realize that we don't have to do that because the awareness and the environment are the same thing. They're just here. This awareness fills the room. And this awareness is the source of true intelligence. We begin to see things not through the filter of this I-other relationship, where we're constantly worrying about self-aggrandizement, accumulation, reinforcement. But rather, our awareness is just right here in this room, in this space, in this time, and we begin to see things stripped of that I-other problem, which is prajna. We begin to see the world as it is, instead of through the veil of my self-concern and preconceptions. And as you develop awareness, you develop further mindfulness too. You become more and more present. The dreams begin to fall away, to become more and more transparent. And less significant. He says with mindfulness awareness, everything is looked at and everything is much cared for. It's an expanded world, greater intelligence, awareness bursting with energy. At this point, your post-meditation practice, that is becoming aware, awake as you walk through the world, that becomes more important than your sitting practice. And this is a point where the Pratyekabuddha fails, because the Pratyekabuddha is completely absorbed in sitting practice. But at this point, we're beginning to move towards the Mahayana, the path of the Bodhisattva, the awakened being. And we're cultivating Vipassana, openness and inquisitiveness. And with this kind of awareness, you are on your way. You are on your way to full awakening. So at this point, we can have a discussion. A lot to absorb, these two chapters. The first two yanas. So I hope that the people who are co-hosting will help spot people who have got their hands up. You can put your hand up literally, or you can do it somehow with Zoom.
Meg has her hand up.
Meg.
I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't remember the word that when they're describing, she's describing the, oh shoot, I wish I had the word, but anyway, I saw myself in this description of the person who's a sort of isolated. And then I thought that was a good thing. And then it turned out to be not such a good thing, to be isolated and independent and not very social, which I think a lot of creative people tend to do. And so I was a little confused about that, because in some ways it seems like it's a good thing, but it turns out that it can be misused or you get too attached to it or something. I'm not sure what my question is, but I wondered if you could clarify it a little bit.
I think you just did.
Oh.
You just said it really beautifully. I mean, on the one hand, we don't want to be reliant on other people, leaning on them. That's why they define the Sangha, this collection of friends, as a group of people who are walking alone together. So that way, if one person falls down, we're not leaning on each other. And the person next to him can reach down and help them up. So we're walking alone together. On the other hand, we're together. And it's a very social path. We're inspired more and more to help other people. And this is what's going to become absolutely prominent as we enter the Mahayana Path, the idea of being of service to others. So the notion of the Pratyekabuddha, especially the rhinoceros style of the Pratyekabuddha, this yogi who goes off and is pursuing their own self-enlightenment. That's what Pratyekabuddha means, self-enlightened Buddha. They don't need anybody else. In fact, they don't even need a teacher. They just go off and find it themselves. And that has to be overcome at some point. It has its virtues, definitely does, because the Pratyekabuddha understands the one-fold egolessness, or the 1.5-fold egolessness, the egolessness of self. And that's a tremendous accomplishment. And it's also a release from suffering, because this belief in a self is a huge sack of woe. We're constantly suffering as we try to maintain and make this self happy and feel like it's solid. So it's a tremendous accomplishment. On the other hand, it's still only the second of the 9 stages in the path. We've got a ways to go.
Trip has hand raised.
Who?
Trip.
Trip.
So what I'm finding is in a quieting of the constant dialogue, becoming more present, becoming more aware, and becoming aware, for example, of the tendency to seek out entertainment. What I've discovered, especially this past weekend, is, and on top of that, a modest reduction in suffering that I find, okay, now what? So I have this huge, definitely an increased amount of energy, and I feel like considerably less pressure on time, because I feel like, wow, I'm actually here. It's wide open. There actually is, it's almost like by renunciation, and by being more present, you free up an awful lot of time and energy. And one of the things that I was gonna, ask you is, then how do you make better use of your how do you deepen your post-meditation practice? So you sometimes can arrive at a better place where you feel like you have more access to yourself and to time, a clearer perspective. But I'm almost like, now what do I do? And I'm just curious if anybody's gone through that, and not wanting to make myself a busybody for the sake of doing something and seeking out a distraction from being in this place. Does that make sense? So I'm curious.
Michael, anything?
Well, for one thing, keep practicing. And I think the other thing is, that's something I think that happens as a result of this practice. We find ourselves coming back in daily life in much the same way that we come back in meditation. We realize that we were dreaming, we realize we were distracted, or something just happens to wake us up. And I think the thing is just to, in a sense, similar to what we do in meditation practice, just relax into that experience as best you can. It becomes a problem if we try to freeze it or hold on to it in some way. So it's really a question of just recognizing that and realizing that it's a part of the experience of the path.
But you say, just can I do a follow-up question? So, keep practicing, and I'm not sure what that means.
Well, continue with just daily meditation practice, exactly what you're doing.
But then for post-meditation, obviously, getting up from the cushion is gonna happen quite a bit. All that intervening time between the cushion, I feel like has expanded dramatically, or it feels like there's just more access to time and space. And when you say, keep practicing, for sure, I get that. But there's I guess, kind of understanding post-meditation practice and the approach to post-meditation practice. I mean, I can't keep walking in a mindful way, in between, not to be a smart ass, but like in between our morning and our evening, there's a lot of time.
Yeah. Trungpa Rinpoche, I think, would, call post-meditation practice really a Vipassana practice. So it's not as much of the kind of, point by point, that shamatha practice is. It really is more that sense of openness and expansiveness and just being in awareness. And, as we, when we start, it comes and goes. The idea is that at some point, as one teacher I heard said, at some point, the nature of our awareness begins to outshine our confusion and our habitual patterns. But, sometimes it's hard to be patient, but that's what we have to do.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
And anything that you can do to remind yourself. Now, the problem is that when you get up from the cushion, there's so many triggers, that trigger you into thought, into your habitual neurotic patterns. So anything that you can do to remind yourself to come back. In the old days, I remember writing things on my hand, to remind me to come back. And the problem is you stop looking. So I stopped writing things on my hand. I remember going to an office supply and buying little circles, that were sticky on the back. And I got them in orange because those are the Kagyu colors. That's the Kagyu color, is orange. And I would put them on my coffee cup. I put them on my cigarette lighter back in those days, when you had cigarette lighters, and on my steering wheel and the gear shift in my car to try and remind me to come back. And the problem I found was that after a while, you stop seeing them. You just get so caught up in thought. But anything that we can do to remind ourselves that we're dreaming and to come back from the dream into awareness in the present moment. That's great practice. It's worth gold. And Michael's absolutely right. Sitting practice helps us do it more in daily life. The more you sit, the more regularly you sit, especially regular. Regular is the most important, to sit every day if you can. And even if it's for a short period of time, just a few minutes. Because every time we sit down on the cushion, we are saying no to that ongoing stream of anxious thought. Trungpa Rinpoche called it neurotic speed. It's like you're on a treadmill with your feet moving underneath you, and they have to keep going. And you're in a forward lean. And every time we sit down on the cushion, we're off that treadmill. Even if it's for 5 minutes, you've taken a break. You've said, okay, I'm not going to check my email anymore. I'm not going to have that next cup of coffee, that next conversation on the phone. So anything we can do to get ourselves back.
Okay.
We have Christy and then Sarah with questions. Christy and Sarah.
John, I loved when you started to talk about the relationship between, let me look at my notes again. It was egoless. Okay, this like coming into egolessness, and in Maitri, like the relationship there. I wondered if you could just talk like you were talking for a couple of minutes, and maybe it'll just hit me in a different way. But I just felt like I wanted to hear that again.
So do I. Yeah. There's really no end to how good that is. I think the fundamental thing is that ego, the belief in I, is painful. It involves us in a constant concern to bolster our well-being, our existence. And we're constantly afraid for our own well-being and our own existence in many, many, many ways. So the belief in I is a constant attempt to reinforce ourselves. If that's there, therefore, then I'm here. And if that's over there says good things about me here, then I'm really, in good shape. And if it says bad things about me, then I'm in bad shape. And we're constantly worrying about this. So every time we come present, whether it's just awareness of the breath, we're letting go of that back and forth, that egotistical back and forth. And we're just resting in awareness. And that rest has Maitri in it. It has a kindness. It has a gentleness for this world. It has an affection for this life that is more and more developed the more we do it. It's letting things be. The real meaning of compassion in the Buddhist sense is not feeling sorry for. They call that grandmother's love. Being a grandmother's fine, but we got lots of them here. But it's sentimental, and it's very dualistic. And what compassion really is letting things be as they are, appreciating them as they are. And that's what happens when we come back into awareness. We see things just as they are, appreciating them as they are, and all their vividness and color as they arise in this present moment. And there's a tremendous kindness in that, a generosity in that. And in fact, the entrance into the Mahayana, which we're going to be coming to soon, the first virtue is the virtue of generosity, and it means just this. Letting things be just what they are, appreciating them for what they are. The vividness and the beauty of that day, that leaf, that tree, that animal, that whatever it is, that other person, the way they express themselves. So, yeah, compassion is very much a part of meditation. And Maitri means compassion when it's directed towards yourself, letting yourself be.
If I could just add, one of the ways that Maitri was explained to me, just in terms of meditation practice, is that we're not judging our experience at all. We're not even judging our not judging. We're just resting in awareness. And that, so whatever occurs, whatever thought arises, we're not seeing it as a good thought or a bad thought. We're not thinking of ourselves as good people or bad people at all. We're attempting to let go of all of that. And that's one way in which Maitri is expressed in simple meditation practice. It's just by being in our experience without trying to change it at all, or trying to make it different at all, or without judging it at all. And that the way it leads into Mahayana is the more we can do that in our meditation practice, just be with our experience without judging it, the more we can do that in the rest of our lives as well. And that really opens up the world to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Val, you had somebody who was next,
Sarah,
and then
Lucy,
Jane. And
and Fred,
Fred, and Jane's got her hand up too.
and Jane. Yeah.
Sarah.
Thank you. I've been curious about Dharma Dhatu. I'm sitting in this room and everything I'm aware of exists because I'm aware of it. So if the door is closed, does that mean that whatever is on the other side of the door is not in existence right now?
No. Those are just thoughts.
Well, but
Theory.
the thing behind the door is a memory of what I remember is behind the door.
Well, that's true.
So, like, it's only a memory. Just so does that mean it's not actually there if I'm not aware of it right now in this moment?
No, it only means that you're not aware of it right now in this moment because the door is closed. That's all. See,
So
this
when I turn on my computer, you're still existing.
who knows? That's a theory, you know. You see, the teachings are all, I mean, it's common sense that I might not have had a heart attack and still here. But what these teachings are about is the immediacy of the present moment, right now, and what we're experiencing. This computer screen, this sound, these voices, the feeling of our bodies, you know, as they arise, thoughts in our heads, all of these things, and they're arising in the instant and passing away as fast as they appear. In the instant. That is the reality. The idea that something exists in the past or will exist in the future is just an idea. It's a fiction. It's a story that we tell ourselves. But what is really, truly real is what we are experiencing now in this present moment. This is the Dharma Theory. You know, this idea of these atoms of experience arising, the picture on the screen, the sound of this voice, you know, the feeling of my bottom on the chair, all of these things are dharmas. They arise and pass away in the instant. And that's not a theory. That's just a description of what's happening. Like these words, they come out, and as they appear, they are disappearing. This gesture, as it appears, is disappearing. It's gone. And that is the real. What's on the other side of the door? Got to open the door to find out. Does that make it clear? It's the difference between what we experience immediately, now, as opposed to theory.
Well, but then I guess I would believe that nothing exists outside of that door right now because it's my dream and I just have a memory of what's behind the door. But right now, I don't see what's on the other side of the door, so it doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't not exist either. That's
Yeah.
another dream.
Huh.
And yet there's a continuity to this, that if you go up and if you turn the knob and open the door, there'll be something there, the hall or whatever it may be, another room. It's common sense. Trungpa Rinpoche called that transcendental common sense. Who is next?
Fred, and then Jane, if there's time.
Fred.
Yeah, so I was reading these chapters over the weekend, and a friend of mine sent me an email where a friend of his is building a company, and then I watched the little promo clip, and he's like, looking to solve loneliness. And I just, my heart sunk. I'm like loneliness isn't a bad thing, And, I guess my question is, how do I inspire more people to accept loneliness or embrace it, perhaps? Maybe that's a better way.
I think by helping them to practice meditation and the Dharma. That's the only way I know. In one way or another. And there are psychotherapies that come to this as well. Good ones. Any way that you can help a person begin to come present and live a life more fully in the present moment with intelligence and compassion, in the sense that not feeling sorry for, but resonating with and open to. Don't you think?
Sounds like that transcendental common sense you were just talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Michael?
I think Trungpa Rinpoche is talking about loneliness here in relation to discipline and, some and study and practice. I think the problem with ordinary loneliness is that, it's not approaches a discipline, and people read into it all kinds of things. What's wrong with me? Or it does turn into a problem. But I don't think that's the kind of loneliness that Trungpa Rinpoche is talking about. He's talking about this in regard to a discipline that helps us open ourselves to ourselves. And ultimately, in terms of the Mahayana, be able to open to the world as well. So that it comes with it's part of an overall discipline or an approach that makes a lot of sense. But just pure isolation is probably not healthy for most people.
Yeah. It's not a matter of sorrow and depression. It's a matter of experiencing one's integrity, really. Now, we don't want people to be sorrowful and depressed.
Yeah, exactly. And there's like a fine line. It's like, they say solitary confinement is like the most cruel thing you could do for people. But then I heard, what was this guy? Was it Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche talking about he did a 40-day meditation in a dark box, and how after his mind went through all these realms, he started to experience just tremendous joy. And he was just like, and there's a line somewhere. And yeah, and like you said, it just starts with teaching people basics of the Dharma, basic mental health, and start somewhere.
Yeah, what you just described is a very advanced practice.
Yeah, that I realize.
It's called the dark retreat. Yeah. Who is next?
It's 7, but Jane has her hand raised.
Okay, this will be the last one. Then we'll have discussion tomorrow.
I read this chapter this afternoon, and especially when I came upon the renunciation and loneliness, it really popped out on me, because I've been thinking about and was really going to ask you about doing a solitary retreat. And I kind of am a little frightened by the thought. I've been trying to visualize what this would be like or feel like. And I had lunch yesterday with my daughter, and I said, I'm thinking of doing this. And she said, well, why? Why, Mom? I'm normally, I live my life on steroids, and I always think that makes me very happy. And I'm increasingly finding myself very content by myself, alone, really having nothing to do and nowhere to go, and seeing that as really positive. And in a way, I think the ambivalence comes from, on the one hand, I was trying to say, well, how many days would this solitary retreat be? Is it 4 days? Would I bring food to like some cabin in the woods or by some isolated area? I couldn't quite visualize it. I think it must take courage. I don't know if I have that kind of courage, and I think I'm afraid of it. So maybe people who have done this, or John, you could speak a bit to it. I'm so ambivalent about it, and yet I'm very attracted to wanting to do it.
You want to say anything, Jinyi?
Yeah, Jane, I think we can talk about like practical parts of like whether you bring food or what you do, since I just did it quite recently. But I think in terms of the ambivalence, I definitely had it because the longest time I have sitting for one day is no more than 4 hours. But in retreat, I sat for 8 hours a day, and I did it for 6 days. And really, I think the toughest part for me personally was the first 2 days where I have doubt about whether I can do it. But really, I think actually, like when you are doing it, you are gaining the courage of doing it more. And actually, like at some point, you just know that you can push through it. So, but we can like talk a little more about that later on. But that's just my personal take. So.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I'll tell you, in the long-term retreat students, what we developed was a routine where before a person would go and do an individual retreat, they would do a group retreat. And those group retreats could be a week, 2 weeks, a month, even 2-3 weeks a month. But once they'd done group retreat and sat, when you do group retreat, you're sitting easily 10 hours a day, and once they'd done that and it was successful, then you could start talking about solitary retreat. And the reason was that we didn't want people to go into solitary retreat right off the bat and fail, come out and, have to, by fail, I mean leave because they didn't like it. They wanted to come out. So we'd like to avoid that. And if you're going to if you want to do an individual retreat, you would talk to me or Michael or another person who's a meditation instructor and qualified to talk to you about retreat. And probably if you were going in, right now there are no group retreats because of COVID. That may change soon, I hope, but at the moment,
Right.
there are no group retreats. And so if you were to do solitary, I would recommend, depending, short, so that it is easier, at least at this point.
Yeah, I've done group retreats in the past, and really found them very, very helpful and effective, and enjoyed them. But that's very different from solitary. But yeah, we'll talk about it as it gets a stronger feeling that this is something that I'd really like to explore. Thank you.
Oh yeah, it's very wonderful retreat when it deepens your practice a lot, and can be a very wonderful experience. And the fact is that most people have never been alone with themselves. We've always got something to keep us occupied and busy. So it's a real interesting experience, to say the least. But we should end, friends, and we have discussion tomorrow if you want to come. And we'll continue this. Right now, let's just end with the dedication of merit. Meg, are you prepared to do it, or shall I?
I could do it.
Michael? Okay.
Yep. There we go. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Have a good
Thanks
night.
all. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Hmm.
Okay. See you all tomorrow.
A lot to digest.
John, you're muted.
That was a very good meal.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. So I'll close the meeting.
Yeah, I guess so.
See you tomorrow.
Okay. Bye, Peter.
Ciao.
Okay.
for now. Ciao for
Night.
now.
Good night. John, did you get the chant?
I did. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. My
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.